Airbnb cabin in the woods, a living nightmare. The cabin in the woods. You should have never clicked that link. You shouldn't have stayed, but you did. And now you're part of a story that no one ever escapes. It began like any other Airbnb adventure. A group of friends eager to disconnect from the noise of the world, searching for an escape from their everyday lives. They found it, an isolated cabin deep in the woods. Picturesque, serene, secluded. No neighbors for miles, just miles of dense, dark trees. The perfect getaway. But as they pulled into the narrow dirt road, the excitement was quickly replaced with a strange feeling, one they couldn't quite explain. A sense of unease crept over them. The cabin stood there, older than the photos had led them to believe, its structure warped and weathered, windows blacked out like empty eyes staring into the void. Must be the lighting, one of them shrugged, forcing a laugh. They carried on. But the air felt heavy, thick with something that didn't belong. When they walked through the door, an unsettling silence greeted them, a silence too deep, too complete. It felt suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Maybe we should go grab some firewood first? One of them suggested, already looking for an excuse to step outside. But then they saw it, an old journal sitting on the coffee table. It was aged, the leather cracked and torn, as though it had been there far longer than they had. The handwriting inside was faded, but unmistakably eerie. The entries spoke of strange occurrences, things unseen, things that shouldn't be known. There was mention of a presence that watched, that moved when no one was looking. A warning written in frenzied panic filled the last page. They know you're here. They laughed it off, figuring it was just the ramblings of someone who had stayed in that cursed place before them. But the further they ventured into the cabin, the more wrong everything felt. The air grew colder, the light from the fireplace seemed to flicker in odd patterns, and the floorboards creaked underfoot even though no one was moving. It wasn't until nightfall that the real terror began. A scraping sound echoed from the walls, faint at first, then louder, as if something was moving inside the very bones of the house. At first, they tried to ignore it, telling themselves it was just the house settling. But when the lights flickered out and a low growl reverberated through the room, it became undeniable. They were not alone. They were being watched. The sounds grew louder, more insistent. The air grew thicker, heavy with the scent of decay. Suddenly, the door to the bedroom slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping one of them inside. The others rushed to open it, but the door would not budge no matter how hard they pushed. Panic set in as they could hear their friend inside, breathing heavily, his voice trembling as he begged to be let out. Then came the whispers. "Join us," they said. "Come home." The whispers weren't from their friend. They weren't from anyone. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards shifted, and shadows in the corners of the room stretched, twisted, becoming something else. The friends finally managed to break down the door, but what they found inside wasn't their friend. The bed was empty. The room was cold, and the walls were coated in what appeared to be blackened marks, as if something had clawed its way out. And then the realization hit them all at once. The cabin had claimed them. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, with eyes like black pools of endless void. Its form was indistinct, like the shadows had taken shape, but it was unmistakable. It was watching them, waiting. The silence was oppressive, the tension unbearable. And then it spoke, a voice not of this world. "Leave, or join us." The floorboards beneath their feet began to warp, twisting and writhing like they were alive. The walls groaned in agony, the ceiling cracked open, revealing nothing but pitch-black void beyond. The air smelled of death and decay, a rotten stench that burned their lungs with every breath. The friends realized then that they hadn't just rented a cabin. They had opened a door to something far worse. Something ancient, hungry, and alive. But it was too late. As the figure stepped forward, the last thing they saw was the cabin, its twisted form, looming over them as if it had been waiting for them all along. And then darkness, the descent into madness. The air was colder now, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The friends, trapped within the cabin's cursed walls, could no longer tell where reality ended and the nightmare began. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and their hearts pounded in their chests like a drumbeat heralding their doom. When they woke, they were no longer together. Each of them was in a different room, each more oppressive than the last. The very walls seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm, as if the house itself were alive. The ceiling above groaned like the body of some ancient creature, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. The windows were gone, nothing but dark, endless space stretched outside. There was no escape. There never had been. They tried to call out to one another, but their voices were swallowed by the walls, by the thick, heavy silence. Every sound felt muffled, as though the very air were thick with something ancient, something malignant, something that had never been meant to exist. And then came the whispers, again. Louder this time, almost deafening. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have stayed. The voices seemed to come from everywhere, crawling beneath their skin. They were no longer just whispers, they were memories. Fragments of other souls who had been drawn into this cursed place before them. They felt them, each soul that had been devoured by the darkness of the cabin, each tortured cry of those who had tried to escape but had been swallowed whole. One of them, Sarah, found herself in the kitchen, staring at a half-eaten plate of food. But it wasn't food, it was something else, something grotesque. The meat on the plate shifted and twisted, contorting into shapes that made her stomach churn. And then it began to move, slowly, like something alive. Sarah screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. Her hand shot out to touch the food, but she recoiled in horror. The walls around her closed in, the cabin groaning like the belly of a beast ready to devour her whole. The whispers grew louder. You belong to us. Meanwhile, Ethan, locked in what appeared to be a bedroom, looked up at the mirror hanging on the far wall. His reflection was warped, distorted. He wasn't alone in it. Behind him stood the shadowy figure, its eyes wide and black, its smile stretched too far. It whispered his name. Ethan. He turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room. But when he looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, only now it was closer. You'll never leave. In a blind panic, Ethan turned and bolted for the door, but the door was gone. The walls had closed in around him. The room was shrinking, compressing, until it was as if he were trapped inside a coffin, the suffocating pressure pushing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. And then there was the door. A single dark wooden door appeared in the far corner of the room, silent, beckoning. Without thinking, Ethan ran toward it, his heart racing, his breath shallow. His hand reached for the handle, but as soon as he touched it, the door swung open, revealing nothing but the deep, endless darkness of the void beyond. It was the same void he had seen earlier, the nothingness that had swallowed the cabin whole. And then the shadows moved. The final friend, Mark, tried to fight back. He was in the living room now, holding a broken chair leg as a weapon, desperate to fend off the growing presence that was consuming the cabin. The whispers had become a chorus now, a cacophony of voices, all of them pleading, cursing, begging him to join them. Mark turned to face the window where the figure stood once again, its silhouette just beyond the glass. But when he blinked, the figure was no longer outside. It was in the room, standing in front of him, its face twisted and contorted, its eyes empty voids of despair. Join us, Mark. The chair leg fell from his trembling hand as the figure reached out toward him. And then, as if on cue, the floor beneath him gave way, and Mark plunged into the darkness, falling, falling, falling. The others were nowhere to be found. They had all vanished. There was no sign of them, no trace of their screams. Just the silence of the cabin and the ever-present whispers. And then it hit him. The cabin had already taken them. One by one they had been consumed. Now it was his turn. Mark closed his eyes, preparing to accept his fate, but the figure's voice filled his mind once more. You've already joined us. The terror that followed was indescribable, an endless darkness, an eternal void. The feeling of being watched, hunted, never alone, never safe. The nightmare did not end with death. It stretched on. Forever. And now the entity, the evil, was aware of them. And aware of you. As you listened to this story, you felt it, didn't you? That tingling sensation on the back of your neck, the cold shiver running down your spine. You thought you could escape, but now the entity knows you. You've invited it. It is no longer just a story. It's real. And it's waiting for you. If you're still here, you know what to do. Subscribe now. Because this isn't over. The nightmare is only beginning and the cabin is still watching.